Welcome to the Coercive Control webinar hosted by the University of Newcastle's Gender Research Network as part of the 16 Days of Activism to End Violence Against Women. My name is Kcasey McLoughlin and I'm a Senior Lecturer at Newcastle Law School at the University of Newcastle and a member of the Gender Research Network at the University of Newcastle. I will be facilitating today's webinar. The Gender Research Network and today's panellists acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional Aboriginal owners of the lands on which our offices are located, as well as other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations from which our students, staff and community are drawn. We are broadcasting from the lands of the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal Nation, Newcastle, Callaghan campus. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. To provide some context to today's webinar, we'd like to first and foremost acknowledge the New South Wales Police Force, Northern Region, for supporting today's Coercive Control webinar. New South Wales Police Force, Northern Region RDVC, Sharon Wilkinson, who works closely with local, regional, state DV services and networks to address the inherent complexities of domestic and family violence in our communities, put forward the idea of running a Coercive Control webinar throughout the 16 Days of Activism, as the topic has been put forward as potential for legislation. This is legislation that will need careful and consultative development. Northern Region Police support consultative platforms such as this webinar as a first point, creating an opportunity that enables discussions on what is a very complex topic. Whilst the New South Wales Police Force cannot comment on the Coercive Control Bill or positions thereof, they are participants of this webinar and welcome listening to the views put forward from today's webinar. I'd also like to provide a trigger warning before we begin, given the nature of the material we'll be examining in today's webinar. If this webinar raises issues for you or someone you know, please contact the National Sexual Assault, Family and Domestic Violence Counselling Service, 1800-RESPECT. If you need to step out of today's session for any reason, please know that it will be recorded and later made available on the Newcastle 16 Days website. And this site also links to additional support services. A web link will be provided in the chat. In February this year, the murder of Hannah Clark and her 3 children, Alea, Leanna and Trey, in Brisbane made global headlines. That she was murdered by her former partner in such horrific circumstances, doused in petrol, where he prevented bystanders from offering any assistance, meant that the crime was particularly shocking. But also, the fact that there was no history of physical violence has drawn attention to non-physical domestic abuse, sometimes known as intimate terrorism or coercive control, and has strengthened calls for it to become a specific crime in Australia, as it is in Scotland, England, Wales and Ireland. One of today's panellists, Laura Richards, was instrumental in seeing those laws enacted. Yet Tasmania is currently the only state in Australia that criminalises this kind of behaviour. A coalition, including Women's Safety New South Wales, we have the CEO of Women's Safety, Hayley Foster, as a panellist today, and other organisations including White Women Australia, Small Steps for Hannah, Women's Legal Service Queensland, Women's Community Shelters, Doctors Against Violence Toward Women, and journalist Jess Hill, the author of the award-winning book, See What You Made Me Do, Power, Control and Domestic Abuse, are lobbying state and federal governments to make coercive control a criminal offence. In October this year, the New South Wales Government announced it would establish a parliamentary joint select committee to look at legislative reform and the state's overall policy approach. A month earlier, a private member's bill had been introduced by Labor MP Anna Watson, also one of today's panellists, called Preethi's Law, after the 32-year-old Sydney dentist Dr. Preeti Reddy, who was in 2019 murdered by her ex-boyfriend and then disposed of in a suitcase. As the New South Wales Attorney-General and Minister for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, Mark Speakman, explained in his foreword to the October 2020 Control Discussion Paper, he described coercive control as a form of domestic abuse involving repeated patterns of abusive behaviour, which can include physical, sexual, psychological, emotional or financial abuse, the cumulative effect of which is to rob victim survivors of their autonomy and independence. He wrote, "The impact of this abuse is abhorrent, but the appropriate response to this behaviour remains an ongoing challenge for law enforcement and legal minds alike." Today, we're going to be hearing from advocates who are doing important work advocating for the legal recognition of coercive control, women who have already made important contributions to public and policy debates and have some ideas about the most appropriate legal response. We're grateful to have the benefit of their expertise in interrogating some of these crucial issues at this critical juncture, in New South Wales specifically, but elsewhere where there is growing impetus for reform in terms of recognising coercive control as a criminal offence. Before we begin by introducing our first speaker, Laura Richards, some brief housekeeping. Audience members are invited to submit questions through the Q&A function, and you can also upvote those questions if there's something that you particularly like answered, but you are also able to contribute via chat. But if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. Our first panellist is Laura Richards, a criminal behavioural analyst and a renowned international expert on domestic violence, stalking, sexual violence, homicide and risk assessment. She worked for a decade at New Scotland Yard as head of homicide prevention unit, head of violent crime intelligence unit and head of the sexual offences section. She is the founder of Paladin, the world's first national stalking advocacy service that was set up following a highly successful all-party parliamentary stalking law reform campaign that Laura spearheaded in 2012. More recently, she spearheaded the domestic violence law reform campaign to criminalise coercive control and helped draft the new law and the statutory guidance, and developed and delivered the first training on the new law in the UK. So Laura, to start us off, as an advocate for legal recognition of coercive control in the United Kingdom, can you please give us some background? What is coercive control and why is this legal recognition necessary?
Firstly, I just want to thank you very much for inviting me to speak. It's a real pleasure. I'm on Venice Beach at the moment, remotely of course. And so it's Sunday here in California, but I think it's a really important thing to acknowledge this is a global issue. And having changed the law in the UK, I'm now campaigning here in America and in Australia to criminalise coercive control. And thank you very much for making me feel very welcome. And I wanted to just start, before I define coercive control, just sharing what a young boy taught me about coercive control. And he said this about his father who murdered his mother in front of him. She was shot. Her name was Jennifer Magnano. And David Magnano said this: "I don't know if my dad thought it was right to kill my mother, but he thought it was his right." And really, when we're talking about coercive control, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about right, and we're talking about entitlement and ownership. So having reviewed thousands of cases and listened to thousands of survivors and families who've experienced this, and having been a survivor myself, I talk from lived-in experience, which I can share with people across my 25 years of studying what coercive control is. And some of the things I always say to people is that it's a behavioural strategy. It's a regime that's brought in to create codependency and exploitation and to entrap and to dominate. And it's important that we understand that, because coercive control is much more than domestic abuse. It is about utter domination, and primarily how men feel entitled to control and oppress women. And it happens very gradually over time. Many victims say to me, I don't know how I got there, Laura, that slowly agency and autonomy has been eroded along with self-esteem, and rules and regulations have been gradually brought in with the key aim to exact obedience. And it is about obedience setting under the guise more often that this behavior that's brought in is to benefit her. And that's why we see about 51% of victims not realizing that it's abuse, and it's very idiosyncratic to them and tailor-made. So you don't see the same case over and over again. It is very specific, and key information about the victim and vulnerabilities are weaponized against them. And the 3 Ds, as I call it, tend to exist in all cases of coercive control, of dependency, debility, and dread. And again, it's really brought in through a grooming process over time when a skilled abuser will target a particular victim. Normally they're polite, they're kind, they're compassionate, and they put other people's needs above their own. Does that sound like anybody? So when we think about victims and victimology and why it impacts more women and girls, the point for me is that we are groomed from birth. Girls are groomed from birth to understand that boys and men are superior to us. And I'll come back to that. But I always say, think more like prisoner of war liberty crime, because it is like a hostage taking, an erosion of autonomy, where a perpetrator, well, Biderman, a psychologist, studied prisoners of war, and he said that there were 8 key principles of coercion. And I'm talking about coercion generally, and I think we have to think about trust that we see in coercive and controlling perpetrators. They create trust, first of all, then isolation. Monopolizing someone's perception is important so that they can then control. And then we have debility and exhaustion as another key principle. And the abuser becomes omnipresent and omnipotent to the victim. They're always with them, even though we may be talking to the victim somewhere else. And threats are brought in by the perpetrator to reinforce and to control with a reward and punishment system. So it's not bad all the time. There's good things, because we have to understand the perpetrator will create hope, that there is hope that things will change. And then there's degradation. And why I wanted to add in other things to Biderman's principles around the prisoner of war analogy of coercion is that what's different when we're talking about women being abused is that there's a culture that sits behind it that supports the abuser and the abuse. And that culture is, as young girls and women, we are groomed that men are superior to us, that we are second-class citizens, and that we feel inadequate. And when there's a problem, we look to ourselves internally, first of all, to fix the problem. And we believe we're responsible for men's happiness and that we can fix it and that we should fix it. So it's much more about the cultural and structural problems that exist and not just the micro in one situation. It's about the macro too, that creates a conducive context for men's abuse of women. So the patriarchy, misogyny, and sexism really does play into further entrap girls and women. And these structured inequalities are also what create the entrapment and ensure that the victim stays firmly wedded to the perpetrator. And when abusers use coercive control and male entitlement, it's dangerous and it can be lethal in some cases.
That's really helpful, a really helpful background, Laura. I was wondering if you could give us a bit of context, one, about coercive control as a precursor to homicide, and that being one of the things really that was part of the persuasive campaign in terms of seeing those laws enacted in the UK. You know, what was really crucial in terms of getting that support for legislative change, because there's sometimes a pushback saying, well, many of these things are already against the law. So what would you say to that?
Well, I'd say for me, it's a 25-year piece of work. You know, I started at New Scotland Yard profiling stranger rape, murder and abduction cases, the cases that people think are committed by strangers and that equals dangerousness. And in each of those cases, the perpetrator had a history of domestic abuse and coercive control. So then realizing that most women are murdered in domestic violence situations where there's coercive control, reviewing those cases, yes, in some you see physical abuse, but some you only see physical once it's at the point of the event, the homicidal event happening. But, you know, having made the case from reviewing many murders, and I brought in the domestic homicide review process in the UK, you could show the data, you could show the cases where women were being murdered. And of course, femicide is a global phenomenon right now. We're at a 5-year high across the world. And it is much more about changing culture, and having changed the law on stalking, which, having run Paladin and set up Paladin, changing the law on stalking and legally defining stalking and making it clear what stalking is. At the point of separation, a victim would report to police and it would be called stalking. Everything non-physical before that point would be ignored and dismissed. I made the argument to the Home Office lawyers, how can it be right that separation is a legally defining point in law, that we only take action at that point once it's escalated, and we largely ignore the whole pattern that goes on before. So it was about closing down a criminalization gap and changing the law in stalking. We showed that the law could be agile and see the pattern of abuse. But right now across the globe, too often people talk about the incident as if it's a one-off event, and the 999 call or the 911 call comes in, they attend said incident and they look for physical evidence to prove that incident. And it doesn't matter how much you train people. I've been training them, you know, police and others for 25 years, standing in classrooms on people's briefing parades with the thought that I could help change attitudes and hearts and minds. And once you do that, you change the fact that they attend the patterned behaviour. The problem was the legislature.
So the focus is on a cumulative pattern of behaviour rather than incident specific. Is that the model that we're talking about?
It's very important that the pattern is understood. With stalking, we understand it's a pattern. It's the first thing I wrote into legislation. So it showed it's possible. So when people were saying it's not possible to create an offence of coercive control, I was saying that yes, it is. We've done it with stalking. We must update and modernise laws. And if there's a criminalisation gap, shouldn't we be trying to understand how we fix that for the women and girls who want criminal justice outcomes? So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But I know that through my research, through my profiling of cases, these are some of the most dangerous men. They're psychopaths, they're sociopaths, and so no, civil remedies on their own or tweaking a definition is not going to be the answer in and of itself. To me, it's and, because you want to give victims, survivors, as many options and choices as possible. But there are occasions when the police and others know that this is a psychopath, this is a very dangerous man, and the victim may not have all that information to hand. And I've worked many of those cases too. So,
Laura, I noticed you mentioned some of the challenges in seeing this legislation enacted, and given that this is currently where we are in Australia, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps you can tell us about some of the lessons from that law reform process in England and Wales, in the sense of why do you think other countries should follow your lead, but also what can we learn from the experience? How can those laws be improved on, and how can that persuasion start to work in terms of law and policy reform?
I mean, first, just to quickly go back, many victims also said to me the physical violence and abuse wasn't the worst part. And therefore, when they were saying the non-physical stuff was worse and there's nothing police can do, I wanted to ensure that we have an early intervention process, that we're not waiting for the escalation. But to the point of your question, you know, England and Wales were the first to criminalise. Scotland had the benefit of our knowledge. And we always campaigned for it to be a 10-year sentence, a minimum of 10 years. But unfortunately, 5 years came in, which is highly problematic. Also, a couple of the things that didn't happen was training. You know, I lobbied and campaigned for training to be mandatory pre-legislative reform. So my advice is always to other countries, make sure you get that money to train, and make sure it's specialist-led training, because a lot of specialists even now, unfortunately, don't see that there's a difference between domestic abuse and coercive control, and are training on some of the wrong things. But I would say creating one single offence is important for physical and non-physical, in the knowledge that sexual coercion, if you have coercive control, will be happening as well, along with financial and economic. And I would one of the key lessons is absolutely putting the focus on the perpetrator's behaviour, looking at what their behaviour, the intent behind it is, the control elements, the oppression, the isolation, the regulation of the victim's behaviour. So, you know, there's a lot more that I could say about it. I would also seek to widen coercive control for all types of situations, not just domestic violence, because there are workplace cases there. And, you know, I came under the lens of someone for a period of time, and it can be very insidious. And the perpetrator may even think they're having a relationship with you. And so with cult situations, I think that we need to see a broader coercive control offence. Domestic violence is very important, but it does happen in other contexts, and it can be just as dangerous.
Thanks so much, Laura. We'll be returning to you soon, and thank you especially for those insights about the need for front end of training. I think that's come out in terms of some of the commentary of Scotland representing a gold standard. It's in the upfront training. We'll return to Laura in a moment, but we now introduce our next panellist, Hayley Foster, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Women's Safety New South Wales. Hayley has over 15 years' experience in the domestic and family violence sector across the following areas: frontline specialist women and children's services, violence prevention, accredited men's behaviour change, family law practice, family dispute resolution, policy, law reform, advocacy, sector development and organisational management. Hayley has particular expertise in integrated multi-sectorial strategies to address domestic and family violence, child safety and family, civil and criminal injustice, and brings a focus on evidence to action and genuine participatory research to the Women's Safety New South Wales work in legislative policy and practice reform. Welcome, Hayley. It's a pleasure to have you here today. The first question really is very much an open-ended one, and it's why is Women's Safety New South Wales advocating for the criminalisation of coercive control? Why are you behind this reform initiative?
Thanks so much, Kcasey, and thanks everyone for having me. Look, it's really fairly straightforward. This has been something that has been asked for from our membership and also from survivor advocates, which whom we work with in our work. Quite simply, the law needs to reflect the lived realities of women who are experiencing domestic and family violence. We've already heard from Laura that, and I'm sure many of you are aware that it is the most prevalent precursor to domestic homicide, but more than this, it's also about women's lived experience and women who are coming to us, and we represent the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Services across New South Wales, who support over 50,000 women each year, mostly after a police incident, and also in 136 local courts across New South Wales as well. So we have a lot of hands-on experience in supporting women to access safety and to access justice. And what we know from women who we're working with day in, day out, is that they're saying that this is the most harmful. As Laura mentioned, it's often not the physical assaults which is causing the most harm or is the most difficult to recover from long term. So we fundamentally think that the law needs to catch up and reflect the lived realities of women. And it also, and Laura's already touched on this as well, it also needs to be less incident based. The law, because at the moment what we find is that when women are trying to access protection from the law, much of the evidence of the abuse that they're experiencing is not actually admissible at this point. So we also know that because it's such an incident-based system, that there's an increased risk of women who are victims of domestic and family violence being misidentified as the primary aggressor. So effectively, we want to make sure that the law is there to protect those who need it, and that it reflects the lived realities. Moreover, and this is actually really important as well, that we think that updating the law will actually create much more community awareness and understanding, not just in the community as well, but also right across the service system as to what is at the very core of domestic abuse. And we will therefore be able to identify it earlier, including people experiencing violence and people using violence. And we'll be able to support those experiencing it and hold those who are using that to account, whether it's through the criminal justice system or not.
Thank you very much, Hayley. That's really helpful to have that overview of what it is that's that's driving your support. And as we know, there certainly is impetus for reform. There is a sense that our legal mechanisms could better protect women in our communities. But there is one concern or one pushback against this move to criminalise. It's about effectiveness. It's about the potential gap between law and experience and how that could potentially even be entrenched by the criminalisation of coercive control. But I think what might be useful is to think about what kind of mechanisms you think might enhance the effectiveness. Thinking about what Laura mentioned about the experience in Scotland, what kind of police and judiciary training are we talking about in terms of making sure that if we go ahead with this process, that it is going to be as effective as possible?
Thanks so much, Kcasey. That's a really great question. I guess this is really, really important because, essentially we know that at the moment that there is a current issue with the misidentification of the primary aggressor in some cases. And we need to make sure, look, the reality is, from what we can see overseas, is that there's not a huge risk with bringing a law like this in and it being misused so much as it just being underutilized because there's not a confidence or a capability in the system. So the kinds of things that we would like to see brought in before the law is actually affected is the sort of things that Laura's talking about. We must make sure that we update our screening and risk assessment tools. So in New South Wales, the Domestic Violence Safety Assessment tool, which is being reviewed at the moment with an eye on coercive control. We also need to update investigation tools and guidelines, so the police standard operating procedures, and also prosecution guidelines as well, and judicial bench books. As well as sentencing guidelines and bench books as well. But on top of that, we also need to look at updating our recruitment strategies for all actors within the system. And that really means ultimately increasing specialisation. We also need, as Laura mentioned, comprehensive training and professional development, but also we need to be monitoring things. So we need to make sure that there are accountability frameworks in place and reviews as well.
Thanks so much, Hayley. That's a really useful summary of the kinds of things that would need to attend any legal reform, because legal reform obviously doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that gap between reform and effectiveness is really about those processes that are put in place in terms of moving forward. And that really is a useful segue to our next speaker, Anna Watson. And Anna has introduced a private members bill. She is the state member for Shellharbour, and her private members bill to criminalise coercive control in New South Wales Parliament in many ways really has put the spotlight in the issue in New South Wales. So if we can turn to Anna now to ask about the particular bill that was introduced earlier this year. I think we're just, come on in please. If we can turn to Anna, I'm going to ask her about the Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Amendment, otherwise known as Preethi's Law, and what she said at the time of the second reading speech is the purpose of the bill is to change the way we respond to domestic abuse and to better define what constitutes domestic abuse to enable greater protection for victims and their children. It will give them the confidence to report what they are enduring. Knowing it is illegal could make all the difference. The bill changes the justice system so that it is better able to facilitate the early detection and prosecution of domestic abuse and coercive controlling behaviours. The main benefits of doing this are to create an informed social and legal environment, reduce offending and reoffending, and bring the incidence of domestic violence down. So I'm really interested in hearing from Anna about what motivated you personally to introduce this bill, and also why this bill and why now?
Myself. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Great.
I think so. Are you there, Anna?
I am. Oh, that's better. I think you can all see me now. Thank you. Well, thank you first to my fellow panellists and for hosting this today. It's a great opportunity to discuss further. Look, your question is a very interesting one, because I was actually motivated firstly by I was in Westminster attending a conference, and while I was there, I wanted to have the opportunity to meet with Anthea Sully, who is the CEO of White Ribbon in London. So I did arrange to meet with her to discuss basically the laws around not so much coercive control, but family and domestic violence, not knowing at the time a lot about coercive control myself. And I found that conversation absolutely interesting. And the conversations that I was having with Anthea was more around the different agencies that were involved, the government agencies that were involved in dealing with this type of legislation. I only spent one day with her, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. And that afternoon, she called me back and invited me to a committee hearing in Westminster itself around the use of agencies, of government agencies in the UK to better be able to track more than anything and identify coercive control, its victims, and how are they to be treated through mostly the NHS. And I found it to be very non-helpful, really, given I could weigh up what was happening in New South Wales at the time, which was nothing. And I thought about it for a long time. From there, I headed to Wales for the day to speak to MPs in Wales about how they came about bringing in a coercive control legislation, what were the barriers, what were the hurdles, you know, in relation to the court, the judicial system, and also police. Came back to New South Wales to further discuss, and I want to acknowledge, of course, Sally Stevenson, who is the CEO of the Illawarra Women's Health Centre, who really did provide me with a lot of clarity around exactly what coercive control was, what it looked like. I mean, the previous speakers obviously work within the sector. Politicians don't spend a lot of time within that sector. So for me, it's been a huge learning curve. And Sally and Dr. Karen Williams have been immensely helpful to me in that regard. I knew something had to be done. I didn't know what had to be done, but I knew that we needed to protect women and their children. And I also want to acknowledge the women and the victims and the survivors that I've spoken to along this journey. They've been so open and honest in sharing with me their stories, and it's been an incredible journey so far. So what happened then was I contacted the Attorney General probably around in February last year, and I just said, you know, what are the government's plans to introduce legislation into New South Wales that will criminalise coercive behaviour. I did mention to him, of course, Scotland, which is the gold standard, which Laura was talking about, and his response wasn't what I wanted to hear. So I thought about it for a little while, and I decided, well, you know, I can't just sit back and do nothing. Something has to change. I saw that there was a gap missing in the Crimes Act, and it must be corrected. So I did some more research, talked to some more people, and I went down to the Parliamentary Council office and spoke to them about it. They are the drafters of legislation, and I requested immediately for some draft legislation to be done so that we could go through it with my party with the view to be introducing legislation. Now, as this sort of went along and, you know, we were talking about it with victims, with services, with the sector, it became very clear to me that there were a lot of barriers in terms of the judicial system, why they were behind it. They saw barriers, of course, the police, there were barriers there, and I think our education system. And you know, and then going through that process and meeting with the sister of Preeti Reddy, Nithya, and her family, I felt like there was no option for me but to push this further and then introduce a private members bill, which I did, and the second reading was done in September. Since then, to be honest, the feedback and the media attention has been very, very strong. I hadn't seen anything like this in a long time in terms of just the media getting on board with this type of legislation. And I also want to acknowledge Abigail Boyd in the upper house, who's also brought a bill very similar to my own bill. There are some slight changes, but it is very much the same bill.
Thanks
I feel
so
now
much,
that...
Anna, thanks so much for providing that background of what personally motivated you, and also your sense that this is really, it's been a time where there is a real sense of it's become a critical juncture in terms of moving for reform. And before we move to some of those issues around the challenges in achieving bipartisan support and what that might look like, I was wondering if you could briefly explain some of the features of the bill that you've actually introduced. I know that not everybody watching is a lawyer, but just a sense of some of those key defining features in the bill as to what your bill looks like.
Well, I think that the most important aspect of the bill is exactly what coercive behaviour is defined as. And there are so many definitions, and it is an exhaustive list. But I thought it important that we get the definition around what it actually is and what it looks like was really important. So that is encaptured very early within the bill. It was also important to ensure that that we had timelines around, possible legislation in relation to mandatory sentencing, whether that be 5 years. And Laura spoke about this, and I wasn't happy with the 5 years either. My argument was it should be 10 years for a conviction, and up to 20 years if it was an aggravated offence. But that's still to be debated, and there, no doubt there will be amendments around that. It also goes to geographical areas. So it's not just New South Wales based. So if the offence actually happens in another state in Australia, then it is also constituted as an offence within New South Wales, even if it happens in another state, if that person or the victim or the perpetrator lives or is based in New South Wales. And I thought that was really important. The other part of the bill, and I thought was equally as important, goes to the Companion Animals Act. What we learned was that a lot of victims were, if you like, punished by the perpetrators by harming animals, killing animals, or destroying, rabbits and dogs and cats and things like that. So that had to be included. So even though, a lot more can go into this bill, there's always room for plenty of amendments. So I've kept the bill not basic. I wouldn't say basic. It's very strong in its wording and what it means, but open to amendments from all different parties and from the sector. And I thought it was important too that we ensure that there was strong sector consultation. And now with the Joint Select Committee, we're going through that process now. My main aim, to be honest, was to drag the government into the boxing ring, whether they liked it or not, turning on the spotlights and saying, look, this is an issue, this must be dealt with. 52% of people in New South Wales are women, and we need to just correct this gap in the legislation. So the bill does talk about defence of reasonableness as well. I thought that was very important. So the criminal proceedings brought against a person for an offence under the proposed sections 14A and B, which are new offences within the Crimes Act, means that it will be an offence to conduct these acts, which will now be punishable by law. Now, in my view, for this to work, there needs to be a huge education campaign. There needs to be money spent on not only training the police and the judicial system, as Laura mentioned, but it also goes to schools. These are learned behaviours, a lot of these behaviours. And I know that Sally Stevenson runs a great program, the Mothers and Boys program. There needs to be a very strong emphasis, I believe, on the education of young people, and that should be rolled out in ethics classes right across schools in New South Wales for this to have the long-term effects that it needs to have. And that's something that I will be continuing to push. So,
This seems to be a theme that we're hearing from all of the speakers, that law is only one mechanism for achieving social and cultural change, that the law itself can only do so much, and that we need training both for those that are engaged in the legal system, but also we need education in a much more wider social and cultural sense, and starting from when people are younger. I was wondering if just before we round out for some questions for all panellists, and you have alluded to this in the sense of some of the challenges you've faced in trying to generate that bipartisan support, and I think your words were dragging the government into the boxing ring, but it does seem that there is now a lot of attention on coercive control, and we've got the committee, the discussion paper. What do you think is necessary to build more widespread support?
What I'd like to see is for whether it's my private member's bill or a similar bill be taken to the National Cabinet. We have a National Cabinet where all the premiers meet with the government of the day to put the agendas that are the issues of seriousness to that committee. I actually wrote to the Premier and to the Attorney General asking them, begging them and pleading with them, please take this bill to the National Cabinet for discussion. Coercive control and domestic violence is a priority of the Premier. And I'm very disappointed that that hasn't happened, and I'm continuing to push that. This just doesn't occur in New South Wales. This is a global issue. So why are we just confining a bill or legislation to New South Wales? And I know Tasmania has some legislation around it, probably not strong enough, and Queensland is also considering this at the moment, and so is South Australia for the second time. But my view is that this bill should be on the COAG agenda, and it should be discussed and it should be given priority. I mean, Jess Hill will tell you, and as will Professor Paul McGorry, that this is the biggest issue that is facing our country at the moment is coercive control. And I think what happened to Hannah Clark, and we all saw the awful footage of that, it galvanised a country. People are still talking about it, and we're still seeing this discussed, and even with Preeti Reddy and others. So it needs to go to the national, it needs to be put on the national agenda, but it also needs the education that surrounds it. It needs to be wrapped around. But more than that, it's all about funding. Unless you've got the funding behind it and you've got political will and governments, understanding that needs to be a lot of funds that put into this. And I see it as a health issue, by the way. It needs to be a part of the health portfolio, in my view. And I will talk more later about the Trauma Recovery Centre and how that's going to work. But this is a health issue, and it needs to be treated as a health issue in conjunction with justice as well. So from a politician's point of view, this is like a big black hole, if you like. It's a bit like the health portfolio in terms of the money that needs to go into it.
Thanks so much, Anna. I'm now going to move to some general questions for all of the panellists, which I think will bring to life some of the things that we have already been talking about putting the spotlight on this issue, training and effectiveness. And that brings me to the first question, which is certainly that there isn't necessarily one clear view about the argument to criminalise coercive control. And certainly some academics have said that Australia is not ready to criminalise coercive control, or at least that we should be cautious about it. And they argue that successful law reform would rely on victims' willingness and ability to involve police and raise concerns about an evidentiary burden. For example, the difficulty in proving the elements of the offence. I might start with Laura as the non-Australian, and then I'll go through. Do you think Australia is ready to criminalise coercive control? Over to Laura.
Well, I think that's a non-argument, quite frankly. When is a country ever going to be ready? You're never going to have everything perfect. we're ready everywhere across the world because women are being murdered at pandemic rates and women are seeking police protection. And they're already going to the police. So we want to ensure that there is a legislative process for them, because once you raise awareness, as I saw with stalking and coercive control, and I hear from hundreds of victims every week all around the world, when the light bulb comes on and when they seek that support, they need people who are trained and they need legislation that is ready and fit for purpose. I really want to see us normalizing exposing male violence and abuse in all its guises. And that's what this is about. It's learned behavior. So it's a patriarchy, it's about power over, and it's only women's voices that are going to change that. It's only us creating and having strong voices together that is going to change the patriarchal systems that do not benefit us, like the family justice system, like the criminal justice system, like society. Our voices get lost. So we have to push and make sure our voices are heard. And Hannah Clark's case, hundreds of others, are symbolic of the appetite for change. And, you know, I 100% believe that you have to make abuse and the abusers visible.
Thank you very much. Hayley, what do you say to this argument that Australia isn't yet ready to criminalise coercive control?
Thanks, Kcasey. I guess I would say I agree with the second part of the question that you first posed, and that is that we do need to take a lot of care. So I think there's a broad agreement in that. I would completely agree with Laura around whether we're ready or not. Were we ready to introduce stalking offences? Were we ready to introduce strangulation offences? Were we ready to introduce image-based abuse offences? Of course, it's going to take some time. I think everyone who is advocating for this to be recognised in law and in our criminal codes is saying we need to be extremely careful about it. We need to make sure there are some changes and some reforms that accompany it and even precede the law coming into force. But we cannot wait. The cost is way too high, and we will certainly not rest until we obtain this in law, so that women can access the protection and the justice that they deserve.
Thanks so much, Hayley. So the emphasis being on, yes, the need for caution and making sure that we have the most well-drafted legislation as possible, but not necessarily supporting the argument that we're not ready, because when are we ever ready for a law reform initiative that changes the status quo of what's been accepted? What would you say to the idea that Australia isn't ready? And our MP, Anna Watson, obviously you were ready in bringing the bill forward.
Unmute. Is that better? Okay. We saw very quickly a few years ago, we were very quick to legislate against the one-punch attack, the coward punch. The New South Wales Parliament did that within 2 weeks. So if we can do that within 2 weeks, I think the community expect us that, number one, above all else, that we protect our constituents. That's our job as legislators, is to ensure the safety and the well-being of the people that we represent. Now, if we can't do that in terms of coercive control, then we've got big problems. I believe that we can do it. It has to be done. It's a no-brainer. As I said, if we can legislate within 2 weeks to protect those victims of the one-punch coward attack, then we can certainly protect women and their children, not just in New South Wales, but right across the country. We are ready for it. I know we're ready for it. We may not get it right the first time, but you know what? We can amend this legislation for the next 10 years if we have to, and that's what I think that we need to be doing. We shouldn't be sitting back and waiting. Sure, the discussions can continue on, and that's all well and good, but let's fix and correct the hole that exists within the current legislation and the current laws. That might sound very simplistic, but it will give people the comfort knowing that legislators and the community are denouncing domestic violence and any type of violence against women.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, from all of our panellists, we've certainly heard a sense of, if Australia isn't ready to criminalise coercive control, well, it probably needs to get ready. and an emphasis though on it really matters what the content of those laws look like. And that brings me to my next question, which is about concerns that have been raised about how these laws might impact First Nations women, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and women with disabilities. This is a concern given that these groups traditionally experience further harm and disempowerment when seeking help from the criminal justice system. I might start with Hayley. What would you say in response to these concerns about how that might inform any coercive control criminal laws that we see brought forward?
Thanks so much, Kcasey. I think what I would say is that we already have, well recognised that we already have a problem with some police and some courts misidentifying women, and particularly marginalised women, Aboriginal women, culturally and linguistically diverse women, particularly women with English as a second language, as well as women with cognitive and intellectual disabilities as well. So we know that there is a problem. I guess we're interested to hear from those that are concerned about further misidentification as a result of this law, you know, where they're seeing that link, because from what we can see overseas thus far, and also from women's experiences of having a very incident-based system and getting caught up because of that, you know, what we believe will happen, and from our observations overseas, is that criminalising coercive control and having more of an emphasis on a course of conduct will in fact reduce the risk of misidentification of women, and particularly marginalised women, in the criminal justice system. Right now, when a police attend an incident and there's been, you know, some sort of physical altercation, and the abuser says, you know, well, she scratched me, or she bit me, or she hit me, or she threw something at me, you know, the police can turn around and say to her, is that what, you know, did you do that? And likely, and what we know about victim and, you know, victim survivor behaviour is that they will usually completely admit, and very happy to admit to everything they've done, very, very clearly. And so in that situation, police are you know, they're required to actually charge, they're required to actually take out an order. And there's very little reflection on the history between the parties in the context of the relationship, unless there's been an actual criminal history of offending. So I think what we would say is that there's an extreme risk at the moment of women being misidentified in the system. And that's not to say that across the board we don't have good responses. We do have really good responses in most cases, but there is a risk. And we don't, you know, when I've consulted with my Aboriginal specialist workers right across New South Wales, what they've said to us is that they've got a major problem with the status quo, and there needs to be more context brought into these situations. I guess the last thing I would say is that it's absolutely critical that Aboriginal community, and particularly Aboriginal women, are involved throughout the consultation, throughout, you know, putting together the provisions, the legal provisions, and also all the accompanying system reforms. We can't think that we know better for communities and those that are most impacted by the criminal justice system. We must make sure that Aboriginal women, migrant and refugee women, women with disabilities, that they are actually at centre at the table when we're looking at these reforms.
Thanks very much, Hayley. Laura, what would you say, and perhaps even thinking about some of the experiences in the UK in terms of groups that are marginalised, what would you say in terms of how these laws impact different groups of women?
Yeah, I think you have to acknowledge that, you know, anything can be used and interpreted. So that's why the training is so important. But I do want to sort of flip it on its head and say, you know, the only way you change the system is by changing the system. And this is a mechanism to create that change. And my goodness, Charlie Malavy's case, if you haven't heard about that, and you probably haven't, it's an Australian case which didn't receive any media attention, or very little in comparison to others, is the very reason why coercive control law is needed. It was very clear that was a coercive control and domestic violence situation, and a mother was discriminated against because that pattern wasn't taken into account, and the fact that the child was being abused by the perpetrator and the mother, that this law has the opportunity, with the training, with all the things that we've talked about, for, you know, you to be world leaders and to learn from us to ensure that the law is interpreted and there's challenges if it's not.
Thanks very much, Laura. And Anna, what would you say to these concerns?
with my two panellists, what they're saying, you know, across many different cultures, particularly in New South Wales. I'll give you an example of one is around dowry abuse with our Indian sisters. That is proving to be a very difficult and wide-ranging issue, because this particular group of women are frightened to speak about it and fear the ramifications of it. And that ends in death as well, as we know that 99% of coercive control does end in a homicide. It just works differently in other cultures. So as Hayley said, we need to ensure that when we're consulting through this joint selective committee, that we take all of that on board. If we miss some, that's okay. You know, we can reintroduce it, but we need to capture as much as we can within this process to ensure that the legislation that will be going forward in New South Wales covers, you know, as much as we can.
Thank you very much, Anna. And all of our panellists have all different ideas, but a fairly well a consensus about the need to ensure that a diverse range of women's experiences are captured in terms of the legal response to coercive control. In terms of a really broad brush question, we know that evidence suggests that underlying causes of male violence against women have their roots in cultural attitudes about the role of women in society, beliefs that are linked to normative, stereotypical gender roles and masculinity. And it raises questions about the effectiveness of our legal reform in terms of whether or not it will make a difference in changing men's attitudes about male violence against women, that men need to take responsibility for changing their behaviour. Or perhaps to put this question more broadly, how important do you see the law as a mechanism to achieve social change? I'm going to start with you, Anna. How important do you think the law is in terms of achieving social and cultural change?
I think the law will go some way into achieving the social change that you're talking about, Kcasey. But I truly believe that education is the key to changing men's attitudes towards women. And as I said before, it starts at a very young age. We need to ensure that money is being spent in education. I want little boys to understand what coercive control is and and how it affects women. But I also want the girls to understand and the women to understand what it looks like, how to identify it, and what they have available to them to be able to discuss that openly. If you cast your minds back to campaigns like the Slip, Slop, Slap campaign, I'm certainly not comparing it, but and the AIDS campaign, that resonated with the community. So we need to run those strong, long-term, ongoing campaigns to ensure that that message is getting through and that we as a community are denouncing violence against women. And I am a strong believer in that education will be a huge key to the success of any legislation. You can bring in whatever legislation you like and have those laws and punish accordingly. But unless the education process is a strong part of that, then this isn't going to work. And it goes hand in hand with the training of the police along with that. I think it's a very important aspect of it.
Anna, I'll now turn to Laura. Laura, how do you see the law as a mechanism in achieving social change?
You know, I think the law is used to tell us what's acceptable and what's not. And right now it's telling us it's acceptable to coercively control and abuse your partner. And that's what it's telling victims. That's what it's telling young boys. That's what it's telling men. And we have to use it as the mechanism that it's there for. You know, our social system also backs up the abuser. And misogyny, sexism, inequality, yes, of course, it needs to be taught to young people, boys and girls, and women and men, because we're all subject to the patriarchy, the power over. But you have to start somewhere. And I think it's really important that we start with laying out a very clear message that whenever we keep saying, well, violence against women and girls is unacceptable, right now, that's not being backed up by any form of action. And, you know, I was a big believer you could do this via training, 25 years of training. I still train now. I'm running a coercive control class tomorrow. But you have to have the legislative framework that understands and lays out a very clear message. As Anna Watson said, you know, the one punch rule, you see these things come in literally within 2 weeks when it impacts men. But we have to make sure that there's a very strong message to the young girls and the young boys growing up now about love and about control and where we draw the line.
Thank you very much. And finally, Hayley, what hope do you have in the law as a lawyer?
I mean, absolutely. The criminal justice system is our bottom line. And look, what we're talking about here is a paradigm shift. So those of us with experience and expertise working in responding to domestic and family violence understand that psychological violence and control is just as, if not more damaging and dangerous as physical abuse. And yet the law is only recognising, mostly apart from the stalking intimidation offences, which don't cover the range of controlling behaviours that we're looking at criminalising. At the moment, our law predominantly recognises only physical abuse, and that sends a really strong message to the community that physical violence is much worse, is the only thing that should be recognised as criminal, and that has ramifications right throughout society. What message does it send to those experiencing emotional and psychological violence and control, as well as perhaps physical abuse? But what message does it send to them about how serious it is, what they're going through? I think the last thing I would say really is that, you know, the conversations so far have already shown us that, you know, changing the law is going to effectively change our understanding right throughout the community. We've already seen this on the front line with women who have seen a lot of the media reporting around this lately, have actually read that and actually realised for the first time, hey, this is me. And they're proactively contacting services for support and for safety. You know, and I guess what Anna was saying about the skin cancer prevention, the big campaigns, we must invest in this as you know, it can't just be the law, though the law is critically important. We must invest in a social change campaign as well. We've seen this done very well with smoking, drink driving, you know, a range of social harms. We need to see the same sort of investment in a social and cultural change campaign.
So it's about taking the gendered nature of these harms really seriously and elevating them so that there's widespread investment, not just in legislative reform, but also in wider community information, education programs, so that we're thinking in a broad brush way.
That's right. And I guess I would pose a question to those that are, you know, really advocating for this to be only recognised in our civil provisions. Do we really understand, do we really promote the idea that those coercive and controlling behaviours are not as serious and should only be dealt with through breaches of an order with very minimal consequences? We know already that it's very, very common for breaches of apprehended violence orders or DVOs or whatever they are in your jurisdiction. It's very, very common for those breaches to occur without any consequence. So to put that back on survivors who are experiencing that as an additional barrier, I think we need to think about that. And I think we really need to think about, you know, what are we saying about, you know, the importance or the seriousness of these types of acts if we're saying that they shouldn't, you know, they'd be relegated to the civil system when physical assaults are recognised in the criminal law. So I think that's something really we really do all need to think about.
It reproduces a problematic hierarchy about about what the law values and what harms it takes seriously. That's a really important point. This brings me to a question about family violence and our family law system. Not so long ago, the former Chief Justice of the Family Court of Australia, Newcastle, called for the criminalisation of coercive control, or intimate terrorism, as he called it. How do you see the criminalisation of coercive control changing or influencing our family law system? Like, obviously, we're talking about distinct laws. We're mostly talking about family law being dealt with by the Commonwealth and criminal law mainly by the states. But do you think that there's still an important role in how this might affect our family law system? I might start with you, Hayley, since I have you.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think this will create substantial change in the culture and practice in the family law system. Already our consultations with family law practitioners, and we've having them approach us proactively because they want to see this criminalised, and they also want to see it in the federal law, like the former Chief Justice has mentioned. Absolutely, throughout the family law system, coercive control is in most cases completely ignored. Because it's not only about the legal provisions as they stand, it's about the culture. So again, making this change at the state and territory level, having this recognition means that there has to be recognition at the federal level. It's also about community awareness and the awareness of practitioners. And look, the thing is, it's not, in the family law system, coercive control is not, it's hardly at all for many practitioners take into account, both in terms of parenting matters, but also in terms of property. So we can have extreme levels of coercive control, and you can't even take that into account in terms of a contribution to the relationship or in terms of ongoing future needs. And so I think this is something that family law practitioners are coming to us thick and fast to say, we need action, we need it across the system, but they're very, very encouraged thus far, those who have contacted us, to say that, we need to see action at the state level, and this is something that will be very, very supportive to those who have clients who are suffering from coercive control.
Thank you, Hayley. I'll turn to Anna now. Anna, how do you see the criminalisation of coercive control as potentially influencing our family law system?
Kcasey, I think the response from Hayley was absolutely spot on. You can't argue with anything she said. No, completely agree with every word that you said, Hayley. You're correct. I think when the Law Reform Society is backing this legislation in, you absolutely know you're on the right track. When you speak to barristers and you speak to Kcasey and even the local legal aid centre, you're on the right track. I have not had anybody say to me, we can't be doing this, it's too hard, this isn't going to make change, it's not going to affect real change. It's all been very, very positive, and I know that everyone's got their view on how it should look, but it is absolutely going to do the job it is intended to do, and that is to ensure that women are protected. We have seen now, and as Laura has said, as it stands now, coercive control is legal in New South Wales. It's not a criminal offence. Doesn't that tell everybody everything about what's wrong with our legal system and that hole that we've got, that gap that I keep talking about? So I don't see that we're going to have too much pushback from this at all. In fact, from the feedback that I'm getting, and particularly with government MPs, with the crossbenchers, all but one are accepting of this legislation. So when you've got lawmakers in New South Wales saying, yes, this must be done and we must correct this gap in the legislation, then of course we know that we're doing the right thing. And Hayley absolutely nailed it, because and it's not just a state jurisdiction, which is why I wanted the Attorney General to take it and the Premier to take it to the National Cabinet.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks very much. And now, Laura, perhaps you could comment on the relationship between coercive control and family law, and even from your experience in the United Kingdom in terms of how it's shaping and reshaping things there.
Yeah, I think, if you update the criminal justice system and the legislative framework, you have to update the family justice system. And what I will say is, in the UK, the US and Australia, a radical change is required. This has been an archaic and draconian and secret process in the shadows for a very long time. And too often coercive control has been ignored in the past, the very thing that's at the heart of what's going on. And I have to say, before coercive control law, I had a lot of victims say to me, I've been told, Laura, I have to leave him for the sake of the children, but the family courts have told me I have to give him contact for the sake of the children. Which one is it? This is where it's a very dangerous situation. I always worked in the criminal justice court. So when my eyes were open to what was going on in the family courts, it was really alarming. And just to say that the family justice systems and criminal justice systems are created by men for men. That's the history of it. That's the legacy of it. so to have it welcomed in Australia, for Anna Watson to have progress there with, you know, senior people and the family or the Law Reform Society backing it, that's a fantastic opportunity right there, because, you know, these little tweaks don't change things, in my opinion. And it is cultural, it is attitude, and the more people who really get it, who are the champions for reform, then the safer women and children will be.
Thank you very much, Laura. I now understand that we are going to move to some questions from the audience. So the audience has had the opportunity to ask some questions through our Q&A function, and my colleague Rachel is going to be feeding some of those questions through to us for our panellists.
Thank you. One of the popular questions today, an audience member has asked, how do we encourage university students who are experiencing coercive control, especially those from different cultural backgrounds, some of whom may have shame or complex cultural issues attached, as well as mistrust of the police, to report and to come forward?
I might start with Laura to answer that question.
Well, I would say pretty much every victim I've ever worked with feels shame. It's just how layered it is. And of course, there are many cultures, including my own, that silences particularly women and girls. So, but there are added complexities, of course, so I'm not negating that, but I think it is a trust and confidence process. You know, majority of the time when people don't want to report, in my opinion, it's because they are fearful of the system, they're fearful that people don't get it. And so working with advocates, and I really do recommend and commend the advocates who at the front line are working with victims and their children to ensure that their voice is very clear in the system. And that the advocate is really the first line, I believe, in this work. That's why I set up Paladin, the National Stalking Advocacy Service, so that victims of all ethnicities, race, faith, cultures have a specialist advisor who really understands their unique situation and can point them to routes for safety and for justice. Of course, they're both different things, and you know, not everybody wants the same outcome. So I think it really is understanding each person's context of what's going on as to how you would signpost them and work with them and support them.
Thank you. I might go to Anna now. Anna, do you have anything to contribute in terms of victim survivors coming forward?
Look, I do. I think a lot of the reason why women don't come forward is a fear that they're not going to be believed. There's a fear there that they'll speak out and they'll be laughed at or they won't be believed. And I think that, well, I know that women need to feel comfortable in coming forward. And as Laura said, you know, advocate is the first line, and I absolutely agree with that. Women need to understand that there are safe places to go and have a conversation with another woman, with a professional in relation to what they're going through. And I've been talking to some colleagues around safe spaces within shopping centres where, you know, you can make an appointment and go and have a conversation with an advocate in a safe environment. So I think it's about setting up the right environment and that women understanding that they will be believed. Nobody's, you know, not going to believe what they're saying, and we're already seeing that that these types of arrangements are working really well, particularly in areas where there is a high incidence of domestic violence, low socioeconomic, and both sides of the coin, to be honest. So I think it is about women understanding, yes, we do believe you and we understand.
Thank you, Anna. And Hayley, do you have anything to add?
Yes, look, I absolutely agree. I think, you know, look, if we're sending the message that emotional and psychological abuse and control is just as important, but at the moment we're not, you know, and so I think those who are wanting or thinking that they're wanting to come out and seek support at the moment have a significant fear that they won't be believed. They also have a fear that they won't receive an appropriate response and that what they're going through is going to be dismissed. And they also have genuine and valid fears that they'll be placed at in greater danger as a aggravating the abuser because they're coming forward to report something that may actually not be taken very seriously. So all of this means that there's a lack of confidence, and a very, women who are experiencing violence and abuse are absolutely adept at assessing all of their risk, and there is a genuine risk at the moment in reporting that sort of abuse. So I do think recognising the law is critical in that sense. I guess I'd also say is that the first response that someone receives when they seek help for domestic abuse is so critically important. And right now we know that there's across the board a fairly decent response, but it's not consistent. Systems need to be equipped to respond effectively on a consistent basis, and that means responding effectively to psychological abuse and control, as well as physical assault as well. So yeah, I can't concur enough with what the previous speakers have said.
Thank you, Hayley. Rachel, do we have another question for our panellists?
We do. Another popular question starts with a comment. One of the big oppositions to coercive control criminalisation is tied to the criminalisation of marginalised people, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, who have astronomically high rates of incarceration and also domestic violence. For instance, often when Indigenous women call for help to the police, they are arrested for outstanding warrants, which in turn makes them reluctant to call. How do we ensure respect for sovereignty whilst protecting Aboriginal women from harm?
What a great question. If we could perhaps start with Hayley to respond to this really important concern.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I'd throw the question out there again. We do have a very real problem with some police and some courts misidentifying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in the system who may have fought back in a particular instance. They may also be vulnerable, like the questioner had said, in relation to outstanding warrants and those sorts of things. They're cultural change issues that we need, right throughout the system we need to address. It's absolutely an abomination if somebody's seeking help from police and from our criminal justice system, when they're in fear often for their very lives, that they have to be concerned that they might be arrested on, a warrant for a fine, for example. I mean, it's absolutely, we're not responding effectively in that case. I guess what I'd say is I'd ask those who have these concerns to provide the link between why they're saying criminalisation of coercive control and those psychological and controlling behaviours, why they believe that would actually make things worse. We're looking at criminalising a course of conduct offence that takes into account that whole, the whole context and dynamics in a relationship. And so, what I would say is that those other issues are there. They're very real, and they're the issues that we are campaigning very strongly on. But we don't see that as an argument for not criminalising coercive control. And I will also hark back to, when we're talking about sovereignty, I think it's absolutely essential that again, we need Aboriginal community, and particularly Aboriginal women, to be at the centre of the table in how we devise these reforms.
Thanks, Hayley. Anna, have you got anything to add to that particular question?
Well, look, there is no reason whatsoever not to criminalise coercive control. No reason whatsoever. In regards to the Aboriginal community, I know that they have their own set of rules, and they deal within their own mobs around coercive control and other issues. In relation to outstanding fines and warrants, you would have to imagine that the police would have priorities. What is going to take precedence here? Are we concerned about this woman's life or the life of her children, or are we more concerned about a few warrants? And I think, in 2020, in 2021 moving forward, that would all have to be put to one side. Let's deal with the main issue first. And I think that would be a part of the broader discussions around continuing amendments within, whether it's my private member's bill or a bill that the government may bring forward themselves.
And what about you, Laura? Have you got anything to add on this point?
I mean, just to say that racism, prejudice, misogyny, we have to tackle it. It's not a reason for not bringing in legislation that could help hundreds and thousands of women and children. And Charlie Mullaley's case, I do recommend people look at that. The advocates must be funded, specialist advocates in each community. But I don't believe that we should let any perpetrator off the hook, whether they're black, brown, white, pink, old, young. You know, there needs to be some form of sanction, otherwise they will continue their behaviour. And what we do know from some of the research from Lundy Bancrofts and Gondorfs and others is that, of course, we don't want to criminalise more people, but prison is more effective, and lengthy prison sentence is more effective for domestic violence perpetrators than any other type of perpetrator. But we are not getting them to court and into prison, and we have to change that culture. The macro picture is really important, but so too is accountability, transparency, so that when a decision has been made and there's a gender bias or there's any form of ism, that individual must be held to account.
What I'm hearing from all of the panellists is acknowledging the potential intersections of marginalisation here isn't really a weighty enough argument to not criminalise. Instead, it's just something that needs to be addressed in terms of the actual model of legislation that we end up with. That's the pushback that I'm hearing in relation to a lot of the questions, actually, that it's about the model that we end up with rather than a cogent reason not to move forward. Hayley, did you want to add something?
Can I add something to that? I just think there has been a bit of, I guess, pushback from those who are concerned about the criminalisation of domestic abusers who go to court, concerned about the whole prison system, and may in fact be abolitionists and not want prisons at all. And there's been quite a lot of I guess criticism from those who have hold those views. I guess what we would say is exactly what you've just summarised, is that we don't believe that those views are a reason to not recognise psychological control and controlling behaviours in the same way that we recognise physical assaults. That is a separate issue that needs to be addressed, and we are very much strongly advocating for a better system of how we actually, once somebody has been sanctioned, what does that look like? What programs do we have available to support people to change their behaviour, for example, to make sure we're not, making violent abusers worse. But at the end of the day, this is about safety. This is about the safety of those who are experiencing violence at the hands of people who are extremely dangerous in their behaviour. And that must come first. That must take precedence. And then, of course, we will continue to advocate for reforms in the way in which we treat our populations in incarceration.
Thank you. That's a really helpful summary of some of the pushback and how we work through that. Do we have any more questions, Rachel?
I could keep going for hours, Kcasey. Another question from the audience asks, to what degree do you see the elimination of coercive control as possible, particularly when our power structures employ and are rewarded for many of these behaviours?
I might start with Laura for that particular question.
Yes, the patriarchy is highly problematic. 25 years ago, I never would have said such a thing, by the way. The P word, the M word that I'm using, I would never have used that as a young criminal behavioural analyst in the heart of New Scotland Yard. And I think, the learning for me is very clear. You've got to shine a light on things first of all. You've got to put the disinfectant on if we're going to, and that's the light putting on it, if we're going to tackle it. And right now it's underground. It's not being tackled. And right now we just have a culture of loading up victims with all the things that they should do and leaving perpetrators unsanctioned. So yes, the patriarchy is something that we're all, we don't know that it's there, but it is. And so we have to keep challenging it. And someday we hope that coercion, we replace that with healthy, collaborative behaviours. And we can only do that by showing what good looks like, by teaching young children what healthy and good looks like. We can't just teach them the mechanics of sex and nothing about what healthy and good looks like. So I believe if you do that, then it's very difficult for abusive men, for the patriarch to recruit those young people into the next generation, because this is an intergenerational issue.
Thank you. I might now turn to Anna. What's your response to this query, Anna?
It's a very interesting question, and I'm even seeing in my own community, Kcasey, that organisations like my local Aboriginal men's sheds are already calling out this type of behaviour within their own groups and within their own mobs, and I can see the effect that it's having. And And I think it's those particular community groups that can make the most difference. This is from the grassroots up. And if these particular groups are talking about this, then that's going to have an effect on those men. I see the blokey unions like the MUA and the CFMEU, they're all coming out now and they're denouncing coercive control. They're denouncing violence against women, whether it's physical violence or emotional abuse. And I think this is a really great place. Obviously, that message is getting out. And I'm seeing it more and more, particularly over the last 12 months. So I think starting from those grassroots up, that's going to have a ripple-on effect throughout communities, not just in New South Wales, but right across Australia. And I think it's a great place to start.
And Hayley, what would you say about the possibility for meaningful change while we exist in a patriarchy?
I think we have to believe we can achieve significant reductions in violence against women. But to do this, we need an effective bottom line, and we need community awareness and understanding of coercive control, which is, again, why we're so passionate about recognising the seriousness of coercive control in law, both the physical and psychological elements of it. We believe that this will be a critical part of driving those changes that we need to see to end all violence against women. We see this as paradigm shifting and really bringing changing culture right across the board, and that's what we need to see to achieve those significant reductions.
I think that's a really crucial phrase, that idea of a paradigm shift about how we understand and conceptualise violence, and that seems to be what's really underpinning what you're all talking about today in terms of supporting criminalisation. Rachel, I think we have time for one final question. If you're able to select one from
oh my
very long
goodness,
list.
so many amazing questions. That's going to be quite hard. Another question that was quite popular asked, how do you respond to advocates who question whether men of colour, such as African American men, who have been opposed and disenfranchised by dominant society, can actually engage in coercive control, where there are historic and current egalitarian features of their intimate relationships with others from their own communities?
Laura, would you like to kick us off with that question?
Oh, I'd love to. I think that anything where you have power over, and whoever gets that power over, the patriarchy is not beneficial for anybody, really. That's, again, whether you're black, white, boy, girl, male, female, it doesn't benefit anybody other than a dominant narrative. So yes, learned behaviors, we just pass them on to the next person. But I've also worked with men and different types of men that, they understand that it's not really getting them what they want or what they need. And therefore you can work with people to give them new skills, new knowledge, new understanding of how to live their life to a better potential. And, just to square the circle on that, sounds a bit woo-woo here in California, but I really do believe that it's possible. People can change, but you have to have a bigger fear to ensure that change happens. And so some who I've worked with have actually said to me, their biggest fear is not going back to prison. Therefore, I'll work with you because I don't want to go back there. That's why we know that prison is effective, because it takes male privilege away, and men are more privileged than women, whichever way you slice it or dice it. We don't realize that at the time when we're little, when we're young, the programming that goes on. But the biggest fear is an important aspect to creating behavioral change. And like I said, you take away the privilege, you take away that entitlement. And if the biggest fear is not going back to prison, then you will be able to see a change behavior happening.
And Anna, do you have anything to say quite quickly in response?
I do. I'll be very quick.
Issue.
Look, I think you'll all remember the Grim Reaper ads, in relation to AIDS and the effect that had on the community, and that affected real change. It not only affected change, but it also was a great education tool that was used to educate the community. I think one of the best ways to do this is through a campaign like that, an absolute, not just scare campaign, but a reality campaign. This is what's going to happen to you if you continue along these sorts of behaviours. But I also think that it's important that governments understand that money needs to be included. We are seeing a very small bucket of money that is being used in relation to the campaigning and the education in relation to these problems. So for me, for a Labor politician, we need to see governments actually commit funding if they want this issue fixed.
Thank you, Anna. And any final remarks from you, Hayley?
Yeah, look, I just agree with all that's been said. Very quickly, of course, in some communities, the patriarchy and the idea, the gender roles, etc., is stronger than others. And yes, we do need to address racism and other forms of discrimination in our criminal justice system. But again, I would not say that that's a reason not to recognise these dangerous and damaging behaviours in law. All of the women that we support want equal protection and access to justice. And, this, I guess the other thing I'd say is that work needs to continue. We've all made this very clear today, that work needs to continue in changing cultural attitudes and understanding, increasing understanding across the community. That work's being done by leaders within a vast number of communities already and continues. But I think by actually recognising this in law, it will give more prominence to that which they're trying to kind of educate and create awareness on and change that culture around, and a language for advocates to be able to do that, to undertake their work in their communities in this regard.
Thanks so much, Hayley. And I'd like to thank all of our panellists today, Laura Richards, Hayley Foster and Anna Watson, for what has been a really informative discussion. Thank you so much for so generously sharing your expertise and for being powerful advocates in this space. I'd also like to acknowledge Rachel Bond, who is the project officer for our Gender Research Network and did all the work in the background getting this up and running. And also, I would really like to emphasise that if this webinar has brought up any issues for you, or you feel like you need to speak to someone, please, 1800-RESPECT is available, and there are also additional resources at the Newcastle 16 Days website. And for all of the people who've been asking about whether or not there will be a link available to this webinar, that is definitely our plan to make that available. And we thank everyone very much, particularly our panellists, but thank everyone for being with us today. We thank New South Wales Police for their support and their willingness to be involved through listening. And we thank everyone for their interest and advocacy in this issue. Thanks very much.